Hello there, it's Tom here, and this is Chapter 12 of Gunnerkrigg Court. Mainly involves robots. So, right from the beginning of the comic, with the introduction of the robot character, there has been a hint of a sort of robotic presence at the school, but I've never really introduced that, and I really wanted to bring that to the fore with this chapter here. Another thing I wanted to do was show that as time passes, some of the characters, even if they're not the focal point of a chapter, they still get up to their own things in the background. For example, here, Kat has been working with Shadow, so we can infer that Annie has introduced the two of them to each other, and so we see that Kat has been working on trying to study exactly what he is and what his physical properties are. And we also see that these shadow creatures are able to vibrate the surfaces that they are currently resting on, and so Kat uses that to give Shadow a voice. You might notice that his speech bubbles are coloured in blue at this point here, the same as Kat's, because I imagined if she was the one teaching him how to speak, that then he would sound very much like her. So this was me starting to really flesh out Shadow's character as more than just a literal shadow, and implying that he has his own intelligence and that he's able to learn things on his own. And there is nothing of interest on this page, and we learn that Annie has seen a bunch of robots, and you might recognise these robots as very similar to the robot that Annie freed at the beginning of the story. We know that after Robot came back from the forest, Eglamour dispatched him with his sword and carried him back to the court, but we have no idea what happened to him after that. So upon finding these similar-looking robots, Annie is determined to see if they know what happened to him. But of course she's stopped from entering the boring door by this door robot here. And here we see that Kat considers the robots very much just as lifeless robots, whereas Annie sees the robot that she freed as its own person and feels that it was her fault that he was subjected to whatever happened in the forest and eventually smashed by Eglamour's sword. Kat unfortunately has to stay behind to clean up her mess, but Annie is determined to break into the place with a little help from Happy Renardine here, and her top-notch disguising skills of putting a pair of dealy boppers on her head. And this little scene here, as well as the chapter as a whole, kind of shows the voice of the robots and the sort of humour that I wanted to convey with them. They are almost polite to a fault, and as such are kind of easy to mislead. And here's another bloody example of not giving the text enough space in the speech bubbles. This is terrible to look at this right here. If these comics weren't already printed in paper form, then it would be very tough to resist the urge to go back and fix small things like this. In fact, working in a webcomic format does lead to the temptation of diving back into your own archives and fixing mistakes and even redrawing some sections, and I certainly did that in a couple of areas, but I maintained a buffer of comics of about 20 to 30 pages from what I was drawing at the time and what was online. So I could read back over pages before they updated, and after a few days see them again with fresh eyes, and if there were any glaring mistakes I would go back and change them. But I really wanted to avoid actually going back quite far into the comic and redrawing a few things. At the time when I was working on these pages, when I was working a full-time job, I literally didn't have the time to go back and alter some of the early artwork. I knew that if I fell into that trap, I would be stuck there forever in a constant loop of redrawing old pages and then feeling unhappy with what I redrew a year or so later. So I accepted that the old work is never going to be perfect, and I understand that the work that I'm doing at the moment is also not going to be perfect. It's just as good as I can do currently. And I used the very tight deadline as an excuse to keep pressing forward and hitting my update schedule rather than getting bogged down and constantly going back and updating what I've currently done and second-guessing myself. Anyway, Annie manages to trick the old poor door robot, who is literally a robot that is attached to a door, and we enter into this sort of secret realm of robots that appears to be very vast and large, and smack in the centre of it is the old admin robot. You don't see him very often, but he is a design that I enjoy drawing. I was happy to be drawing this chapter because it was the first time I was able to start drawing different types of robots. Up until now, we'd only really seen the robot that Annie had rescued, but now we get to see a few different types of robot. And it also got me used to establishing a unified sort of look for the robots that I would pretty much stick to for the rest of the comic. So Annie learns that Robot was disposed of, at least his body. His body was paper-clipped. And she also learns that his mind was taken to research so that they could study his criminal behavior. Oh, just as a brief aside, the admin robot does mention that S13 is quite sought after, not least for the trouble he causes, which is kind of an implication that he has been known as a troublemaker or at least for having some known history with the other robots in the court. So Annie heads on down this very long corridor, again showing that the court is unreasonably large. And we see a part that I had been looking forward to drawing for quite a while, where we see that Renard is able to change the shape of the toy that he is in. And because the toy itself is supposed to be of a wolf, he becomes a wolf himself. And we see that he has his symbol constantly on display in his forehead. Now, when he is in his sort of impish toy form like this here, he does not have the symbol on his head, even though on the cover of the Volume 1 he does have the symbol on his head. But he's able to make the symbol appear and disappear, except for when he is in the wolf form, and the symbol is always present. That was just a decision that I'd made to make his wolf form look a little bit more distinctive. Already here we see that Annie and Renard aren't constantly bickering at each other or bitter or combative towards each other, but they do still keep each other very much at arm's length at this point. So Annie finds S13's brain chip, and they break it out, and as soon as she picks it up, an alarm goes off, and some more big old robots come along. And I thought it was kind of funny, these big, typical boxy, burly-looking robots are probably not used to human behavior, whereas if they're only used to guarding against other robots, I'm sure that if they told a fellow robot to halt, then that robot would halt. So here, when they shout halt, and she and Renard both run off, the robots think that maybe she didn't hear him, or understand his request, and to say it again. So Annie and Renard charge back, past the admin robot, down past the doorbot, and back out into the normal part of the court. So they head back to Kat, and she has just a standard dock that she can put the robot brain chips into, and as soon as she does, the robot is active again, and it's showing his thoughts. And here we see that the last thing that he is remembering is that Annie fell off the bridge back in chapter 8. But he sees Kat and thinks that she's an angel, and is able to calm down once he sees Annie. And we get to see a bit of what happened to him in the forest. Now at this point we see that Renard is angry, and that is because, for all he knows, a robot came out of the forest and tried to grab him and push Annie off the bridge. What he didn't know was that Annie was the reason why the robot went into the forest in the first place. Now that he knows that Annie was the reason why essentially core technology was introduced into the forest, he is super upset and hints that something is going to come of all this. And he mentions his cousin. So the chapter ends off here with Kat promising to make Robot a new body, which is the start of a long-running subplot to the comic, and the chapter ends there. Now that I look back on it, this bonus page is, I guess, kind of risque. I guess it's one of the points in the comic that people always refer back to, and people seem to get a kick out of it anyway. It kind of shows both of their personalities. On one hand, Renard's willingness to tease Annie, and then on the other hand, Annie's complete lack of reaction, while doling out the justice of having Renard go back into his box. It just shows that she won't stand for any of his crap. And there we go, that's the end of the chapter. Come back again for chapter 13, A Week for Kat.